Morning as part of the information security program at the university. There's one of the requirements that we want to make sure that we fulfill every single year is getting a review of the university records retention policy and best practices. Thankfully, we've got a great resource for that here at the university level with Perry Swift, who's a university records manager. So wanted to make sure that we got a chance to get everybody together on this today and have a nice presentation together to kind of help us refresh where things currently stand at the university level and make sure we get a good recording for this for the rest of our college community. So with that, Perry, I'll let you take it away and we'll all mute and we'll go from there. So thanks for joining us today. Really appreciate it.
All right. Well, good morning, everyone, and thank you for tuning in on a Friday morning. We do have a lot of material to cover, but I will pause periodically at the end of various sections to see if anybody has any questions. This will just be kind of an overview of a lot of topics. We do offer longer paper and bites that go into more depth, and I have a goal in the next couple years to hopefully get smaller training pieces on more particular topics online. There we go. All right, so a couple quick stats here. Without records management, every year the records that you have are going to grow by about 25%. That's pretty obvious in paper format when it's taking over our offices and taking up valuable space that we could use for other things. It's harder to see this 25% growth electronically. We just think of electronic record storage as unlimited, and it's really not. And we keep increasing the amount of storage space that we need, and that increases a lot of other things as well. So without records management, about every 12 seconds, a document is lost. So if we think about the typical 12 or 8-hour workday, we're looking at about 2,400 documents being lost every day. And lost means we can't find them when we need to be able to get our hands on those records. Without records management, when you are on a computer, you're spending about 7.5% of that time looking for files. So if we look at the typical 260 work days that we have each year, that's almost 20 days that we spend looking for files on a computer. And I've had many people tell me that it's probably more than 7.5% of their time. It can be really frustrating when you are needing something, you're on a roll, you're working, and then all of a sudden you can't find something. And you have to take that time and stop what you're doing and do some searches and attempt to hunt it down. So the purpose of records management is to ensure that records are available when they're needed. And we think, oh, we're a public institution, we need them for public records requests. That is absolutely true. But we don't get public records requests every day. Well, they come into the university every day, but we ourselves don't get public records requests every day. But every day we're doing our jobs. And there are records that support the jobs that we do, whether we're creating them or whether we're receiving them as part of our functions. So first and foremost, we want to be able to make sure that we can get our hands on the records that we need to do our jobs. But then we also do need to have them readily available for public records requests. And we also have to be able to locate them and identify and preserve them and make them available during litigation if needed. The purpose of records management is also to protect records from improper or unauthorized destruction. What that means is if it's not on a retention schedule, we're not allowed to destroy it. It's against Ohio law for us to destroy records if they're not listed on a retention schedule. It also means that we have to wait the right amount of time. That's what retention schedules do. They tell us how long we need to keep records, and we need to make sure we keep them for that amount of time. If we don't, we can face up to $1,000 per document fine for destroying records improperly. And then finally, kind of the opposite of that, we want to make sure that we don't keep records too long. So when the retention period has expired, we want to have a regular process of destroying or deleting those records. Because retaining records too long can be as much of a liability as not retaining them for long enough. So let's look at that a little bit more. Some other benefits to records management is transparency in government. Records tell how decisions were made, who had authority to do certain things, what our processes were, how much money we spent on things, whether communications happened. So records are transparency in government. Having good records management helps us be more responsive in that regards. Records management will help us save resources, whether it is getting our stuff out of offsite storage or our own office space, making sure that we're not continually needing to find more space, or whether it's server space or cloud storage space, or the time that we spend looking for things. So it's going to increase efficiency. When we're getting rid of stuff on a regular basis, there's less for the servers to chug through to find what we need. There's less for us to have to look through to find what we need to do our jobs or to respond to those public records requests or discovery requests. And then finally, good records management helps us decrease our risk in a number of ways. And that's part of why we're here today, is to talk about that risk and information security. So let's look in depth a little bit more at how records management helps us decrease our risks. Public records requests, we have to respond in a reasonable amount of time. Now, if you could see me, I always put reasonable in air quotes because reasonable is not very well defined. Somebody can take us to any level of court in the state of Ohio if we don't respond in an amount of time that they define as reasonable. So each person can define that. They can also go to the Court of Claims and spend just $25 to push us into mediation concerning public records. I already mentioned the illegal destruction of records, destroying records before they have met their retention period or without them being on a schedule and having a $1,000 fine per document. That does come up. Luckily, there is now a cap on that, but it still happens. Here's a security risk right here. We always think of security risks as being electronic, but really a security risk can happen with paper. You know, I've been doing this for 18 years, and in the state of Ohio, we've had a number of instances of documents from public agencies with personal information on it being put in the dumpster, being found blowing down alleys. So your paper records can cause security risks too if we leave them where they're easily accessible. Discovery. Records are asked for in discovery all the time. There are a lot of our supporting documentation, either in making our case or in defending ourselves. But during discovery, opposing counsel can ask for a lot. And the better organized our records are, the easier it is for us to narrow down that wide net that they cast, because we know where our stuff is and we can say we only need to look in these spots. And as well, if we're implementing good disposition, there's less that we need to make available in discovery. Because while a lot of records protect us, sometimes there are records that may not necessarily play in our favor. And then finally, there is information security and privacy risks involved. We just heard last week, now I'm drawing a blank on it, it was one of the credit card companies, was it Capital One? They just had a security breach. And we were talking about, I think, 100 million people had their information breached. And some of it was unencrypted. You know, the credit bureaus have had their information breached. We can set up the best security in the world, but hackers are continually working to find their way around it just as much as we are working to protect ourselves against it. When we're implementing records management and we're implementing disposition on a regular basis, there is less that is available for them to get their hands on. And that means less credit monitoring, less money spent on notifications, and just a better PR look when we have limited exposure in those areas. There are some repeating concepts in records management. Records retention is based on content. It's based on the information that the record contains. It's not based on the media or the storage format or the transmission format. It's based on the information content. We need to retain stuff in accordance with applicable retention schedules, and everybody is responsible. We all have email. We all have places on servers or places in databases and systems that we can go to and create and store records. So we're all responsible for records management. So this is the biggest piece of code that I'm going to read you today. This is the code that basically says we can't destroy records unnecessarily. It says all records are the property of the public office concerned and shall not be removed, destroyed, mutilated, transferred, or otherwise damaged or disposed of in whole or in part, except as provided by the law or under the rules of your records commission. So by law, the trustees are supposed to create a records program, and that records program runs out of the university archives. And I am the university records manager, so I'm responsible for implementing this records program and making sure that it stays on track. The goal of the records management program is to establish a systematic, repeatable, documented process for the retention and disposition of records. It's really important that this is a documented process. We want to have written instructions for how we're going to run this process. What do we need to do and how are we going to do it? And that written documentation of this process, we need to demonstrate in a repeatable fashion that we're following it. So we need to demonstrate that we're submitting the certificates of records destruction on a regular basis and getting rid of stuff. We need to demonstrate that we're following our retention schedules and be able to prove that. You know, we can be asked about this in various court and litigation situations, asked to produce this documentation and then asked to demonstrate and show proof that we are implementing it and following it. So some of the documents for compliance, the retention schedule, which I've already mentioned quite a bit, it's the law that we have to have a retention schedule. And what it does is provide for ongoing disposal of records, and that prevents the unnecessary buildup of records. We can very simply think of it as when 1 year of records is expiring, we get those records off of the shelf or off of the server, and then that space that's been cleared up is used to fill in with the current year's worth of records. So hopefully we're not needing to continually increase our space. We're maintaining kind of that status quo. The retention schedule is also a legal asset. I am frequently asked for retention schedules by the Public Records Office so that they can give them to records requesters, whether the requester is asking the schedule itself or whether the requester is asking for records that we no longer have, and they want to show that we don't have them, but it's okay because everything had met its retention period according to our retention schedules. And then retention schedules also help us negotiate public records requests. A lot of times people make those really big, broad requests because they don't actually know what records are going to have what they're looking for. So they cast this wide net. But if we have a good descriptive retention schedule, we can help them by saying, hey, take a look at this. This is going to talk about the types of records we have, and tell us where you think the records you're looking for might fall. So we want to create it for somebody who has no knowledge of the records. You guys are subject matter experts in the records that you're creating. So it may seem obvious to you, but to me, to the archivist, to somebody from the public, it might not be as obvious what information records contain. And then there's the certificate of records destruction, and that's the disposal documentation. We'll talk about that process in a little bit. But administratively, it lets us know whether the records exist or not. And legally, it's proof that we complied with our retention schedule. It says, hey, this is what we're disposing of on this date, and it matches it to the schedule so we can show that we waited the appropriate amount of time. The certificates of records destruction are often asked for in public records requests and in discovery as well, because when lined up with the retention schedule, it shows that we followed what we were supposed to do and helps in our defensibility. Additional documentation that we have is the records management policy, which is available on the website, and it should be updated probably at some point in the next year. But then records management is incorporated into a lot of other policies right now. It's mentioned in HR personnel policies. It's mentioned in the recently released social media policy. It's going to continue to be mentioned in a lot of these other policies. So at this point, are there any questions about the importance of records management, or shall we go on to talking about retention schedules and how we determine retention and those basic processes? All right, I'll go on, and there will be additional times for questions as we go on. For units, I recommend somebody having a records officer. And that records officer is going to be somebody who understands the duties and responsibilities of that particular business unit. And that includes how the records are created and maintained and how those records support the functions of the office. Because what we're going to find out is that how long we need those records to support those functions is really important when it comes to developing retention schedules. But the records officer would be responsible for the functions of records retention and disposition, for being a liaison with me to tell me, hey, I think we need to update the retention schedule. We don't create this type of record anymore, or we're starting to create a new record. And then that person can also be the one who reviews the certificates of destruction and then sends them on to me for approval. At this point, let's talk about what are we talking about when we say a record, because there's all kinds of definitions of records that float out there. And a lot of times what we think of a record is actually a public record. But in records management, we're not just dealing with those records that have to be made available to the public. We're dealing with all records. So this is the definition that we're actually following. It has 3 parts. Any document, device, or item, regardless of physical form, is the first part. The second part says that it's a record if it's created or received by or comes under the jurisdiction of Ohio State. And the third part is that it documents our organization, functions, policies, decisions, procedures, operations, and other activities. So if it meets all 3 of these parts, it is a record. It needs to go on a retention schedule. We need to complete the certificate of records destruction, and we need to manage it. So again, we in records management are dealing with all records, whether they are public or whether they have exemptions. It does not matter. It matters to the Public Records Office and what they release, but it does not matter to records management. We also talk a lot about records series. This is how we kind of group records on a retention schedule and on our CRDs. So a record series is records that are created for the same purpose. They contain the same types of information, and a lot of times they're filed in the same way. So if you think about phone bills, every phone bill, regardless of whose phone bill it is or what year or what month, they all contain the same type of information. Who we called, who called us, how long we talked, how much it cost the university. And so that's how you think about a record series. All phone bills do basically the same thing. So phone bills is a record series. Some common things that are records, working papers, that includes drafts, versions, copies, which is one of the reasons why we want to limit the number of drafts and versions and copies that we have hanging around. Those things can be asked for in public records requests. And while they are record and we do have to provide them, drafts and versions and copies have lesser retention periods. Drafts can be gotten rid of when the next version is available or when the final version is available. So we don't need to keep all of those for the same amount of time, and if we do, we might need to make them available. Things in databases are most likely records. We think of databases as these little pieces of information, but really if you picture a database, a lot of times you're entering information on something that looks like an online form, or the screen has these little pieces of information, but you're entering the same pieces of information over and over again. So if it's a database of student records, for each student, it's capturing the same pieces of information, and those pieces of information come together to make a record on the student or a record on a vendor. Student coursework is record, personnel, finance transactions, litigation, research projects, and then your IT records, those system logs, those are records. And then I want to go back to correspondence. I did intentionally skip correspondence at the beginning. Correspondence is a record in and of itself, and we have something on the general schedule for your very basic correspondence, and that has a year retention period. I like to think of that as kind of that form letter correspondence or informational, pointing them to something on the website or sending them an attached form that they need to fill out. But correspondence can also fall under any other record series that the correspondence relates to. So if you're responsible for budgets and you have correspondence relating to the department budget, that should probably be kept as long as you keep other budget material. If you're an advisor and you have correspondence, advising correspondence with a student, you might want to keep that as long as you keep advising documentation. So correspondence can also fall under any other record series that the subject of the correspondence relates to. Things that are not records are blank forms. We haven't filled those in yet, so those are not records. Unsolicited materials that we don't use are not records. Copies of records copies of things that you receive at a seminar. So you go to a professional conference and you come back with copies of their PowerPoint presentation and maybe some glossy vendor handouts. Those aren't records of the office. And so you only need to keep those as long as they might be of use to you. And then finally, personal notes aren't records. So if you're making personal notes on an employee or on a student or from a meeting, as long as those notes are not shared with somebody else or maintained in a place where somebody else could easily access them, then they are not record. They can be bumped into the record category if they are shared or if they are made more readily available, or if they are called for in discovery, because discovery has a totally different definition of record from the Ohio Public Records laws. We create and interact with a lot of different offices here. We have some centralized offices at Ohio State, and we send stuff to those offices. So there are certain duplicates that you may have that you don't need to keep as long because they're being kept by another office. So things that you put into, say, eRequest or eTravel, that's now maintained by Business and Finance, and they're responsible for the originals. So when you scan and upload copies of receipts or proof, you don't need to keep those once you scan them and upload them. There are certain records that you send to the Office of Human Resources that they're responsible for maintaining. Or the University Archives, when we're responsible for maintaining the certificates of records destruction. So for example, you are ready to destroy some records that have met their retention period, you fill out a CRD and you send it to me. I'm going to approve it. I'm going to put my initials on it and put the date that I approved it and file it, and I'm the one that's responsible for keeping those for the duration of their retention period. What you have at that point is a copy, and you can get rid of it because I'll have it. You can always contact me if for some reason you would need to see a copy of those CRDs. Retention schedules try to include information that describes the purpose and the function of the records, just one sentence that describes what the records are used for to help somebody understand what it is. And then it also says the type of information that can be found in that record series. And it's very helpful for people to understand really what a record series is and what they're going to find in that series. So it states those two things in the description of the record series, and then it says how long it's going to be kept. And then we add a couple other things in our records retention schedules as well, and we'll take a look at that in a second. There's two types of retention schedules at Ohio State. The first is the OSU General Schedule. This has record series that are common to multiple units across campus. It tends to standardize retention periods. That way, everybody is keeping HR records for the same amount of time across the university, or everybody's keeping student records or legal records for the same amount of time. Most units on campus use the general schedule in some capacity. Some use it exclusively. It's the only retention schedule they need to use because everything that they create is covered on it. Other units do create some more unique records that are pretty much only created and maintained by them. So they'll have a unit-specific schedule, but also use the general schedule. So let's take a look at the general schedule in a second. So you can go to the website, and the general schedule is here. I'm just going to click on the link, but I would highly recommend, if you're going to use the general schedule frequently, that once you click on the link, you actually do download it. it has a little bit more functionality when you download it. So when you look at the retention schedule, you'll see the list of records that are maintained by centralized units that we talked about, some definitions of the different types of destruction, and then we come down to the general schedule. So we have accounting and financial records, human resources, administrative, legal records, information technology records, and student records are covered in the general schedule. So you'll see there's a record series title, as well as a lot of them will have a description. As I go through and update, I'm trying to add more descriptions to retention schedules. In the center column, you'll see the retention period. Sometimes it's going to be a flat number of years, and sometimes it's going to say active plus. And what we've tried to do on newer schedules, including the general schedule, is define what active means, because in this case, for bids accepted, active is the life of the associated contract. But down here, when it comes to the budget planning file, active is only while the budget is current. And if we keep scrolling down out of financial records, we're going to see that active can mean all kinds of different things. Let's get into human resources. When we get into human resources, active can be while the employee's service or while the employee is at the university. Student records, it could be a couple terms is what active is, or it could be as long as the student is here. So since active changes, we've tried to define what that is so that everybody understands what active is for each different record series. In addition to the retention period, we also have added how something should be destroyed, whether it's destroyed secured and you need to use a shred bin, or whether it is simply a destroy where you can just delete, or you can put in the recycling bin. And sometimes there's going to be something that we want to see at the archives, and it will say transfer to the university archives. So we're trying to go along with the security standards to make sure the data is destroyed appropriately. So that is the general schedule. And then we also have unit-specific schedules. They look fairly similar. The older ones aren't going to define what active is, but as I go through and work with units to update it, we are trying to add that in. But unit-specific schedules are based upon documents that are uniquely created and used by a specific unit. If something is the same, or the same record series appears on the general schedule and the unit-specific, it tends to trump the general schedule. But only if it's more. We usually do not do unit-specific schedules for less than what it might appear on the general schedule. You can always take a look at university-specific or unit-specific schedules and say, hey, everything is covered on the general schedule now. We don't need this unit-specific schedule. You can let me know that, have an official email me, and I can mark that unit schedule as retired. I'm always willing to come and talk to you to go over retention schedules and update them. They really should be reviewed every couple years. And we are going to be coming up on a review of retention schedules in probably the next couple months. There is a list of unit-specific schedules on the OSU Records Management page. We don't have the schedules themselves posted, but if you email me, I can send you a copy of the schedules that you're looking for. Quick note about storage media. It's storage media and transmission method are not record series. And they don't equal the retention period. So we don't say all email is kept for 1 year, just like we wouldn't say all paper is going to be kept for 1 year. Again, it goes by the content of the record. And then the certificate of records destruction. So once we have a schedule that's complete, anytime you're ready to get rid of records, a certificate of records destruction should be completed and emailed to the live records email here on the screen. Try to give us about a week. The person who responds to these is in the office Tuesday through Thursday right now. And let's take a look at the CRD. So the top part you'll fill out is the information about the unit and the person who's completing the CRD. And then you're going to type in the record series title here. So it might be student coursework graded. And then you're going to put the inclusive dates of the records that you're getting rid of. So if it's been a while since you've done a disposition, it might be a longer date range. Hopefully you're going to get to the point where maybe every semester you get rid of this data, or every year you get rid of a group of finance records. And then over here you can select which schedule you're using. Is it a general schedule or a unit schedule? And you can put as many record series on this as you want. So the next record series that you get rid of might be advising records. We're not asking for an item by item, a paper by paper, or document by document inventory. We just need to know what record series based on the retention schedule and what the dates are of the records that you're getting rid of, so that we can do the math and make sure that the retention period has been met. And I have some screenshots of that. So it's important to document your disposition so you know whether or not you still, I went the wrong way, still have it, and so that we have our proof that we complied. Before I go on to email and electronic records, are there questions about retention schedules, about the CRD, about the process? And I should mention at this point, if anybody is putting records into OnBase, we will be automatically applying retention to those. I'm working on mapping those things right now. Once automatic retention is turned on, you won't need the CRD for stuff in OnBase. But until then, we still do need the CRD, whether it's paper or any form of electronic record. Are there any questions up to this point? All right, let's move on to email and electronic messaging and electronic records. We create a lot of them. That's probably an understatement. But this picture gives you a sense of the types of records we create, from very, very short-term, transient records, or things that aren't even a record at all per that definition. And we create so many of those things, especially in email and electronic messaging. And the problem with that is, if we're not continually cleaning that stuff up, it overtakes the red and the purple and the green, those messages that are records and that we do need to keep per retention schedules for some amount of time. And it makes it difficult for us to sort through and find those records that we do need to maintain in order to make them available, or in order to do our jobs, or ultimately to be able to delete them. So this is a pretty popular slide, because this is a slide where I'm telling you what you can go ahead and delete. These things are either transient or they're non-record. They do not need a CRD, and they should be cleaned up pretty regularly. The first is anything that's unsolicited, like spam or ads and non-work related things. Any personal emails that you're sending, or text messages that you're sending through a university account, those things should be deleted. But try not to use your university accounts at all for those things unless you really need to. But even inter-university communications, if you're asking a colleague if they're ready to go to lunch, or if they want you to pick them something up from Starbucks, that doesn't meet the definition of a record, the third part that talks about documenting the office. So that's a personal communication that is non-record. Emails that are sent out to a lot of people for administrative purposes can be deleted. You know, once you schedule your flu shot and download the paperwork that you need to turn in, you can delete that email. Any emails about kitchen cleanings, delete those emails. And the on-campus daily news headlines, read that, click on the article, sign up for what you need to sign up for, and then go ahead and delete that. That's being maintained in one place by the group that's responsible for compiling and sending that email out. A lot of us are on listservs, professional listservs, or we took a webinar through a vendor and now we get information from that vendor all the time, more webinars or white papers. Those things can be deleted once you've done with them what you need to. If it's a professional listserv or discussion board, a lot of times what's being talked about doesn't necessarily relate directly to your job at the moment, and you can delete those emails. Now, if you were to post to the board and say, hey, we're thinking about getting this new piece of software, has anybody used it? Do you have any comments on it to help us make our decision? In that case, then those discussions might become part of our record and we would need to keep them. But generally speaking, if we're not actively engaged, if we're just kind of watching it and it doesn't really have anything to do with us for a particular topic, we can delete those. And then things that are transient, accepted and declined meeting requests. These are so easy because the official record is maintained on your Outlook calendar. So you can go in and you can sort your inbox and you can sort your sent box, both of them by type, and scroll down to the bottom. That's where these meeting requests are. Grab them all. You can do a shift click on the first and the last one to get them all and then delete them. Red receipts are transient. You can get rid of those unless for some reason you've attached that red receipt because you do need to show legal proof of delivery. Meeting arrangements. We go back and forth talking about meeting arrangements in email all the time. Once we've established where that meeting is going to be, get rid of those emails. Other messages that you could easily tell somebody, pick up the phone and call or walk over to their office, but you choose to email, a lot of times those are transient and can be deleted. FYIs. FYI, I thought you might like this article. Those can be deleted, whether you're the sender or the receiver. If you're CC'd, generally you're not being asked to take action on a message, and it's kind of like the FYI. And then sometimes we send messages back and forth that are drafts of correspondence that maybe we're sending up the chain. So maybe I have to send something to the director of the libraries. I might craft my message in an email and send it to my supervisor and say, hey, how does this look? Do you have any suggestions? And we might go back and forth and make it look really good first before we send that final copy. All those drafts, those back and forths, that's all transient and can be deleted, just so long as I keep that final email that I send to the director. Now that I've told you all of the things that you can delete, there are things that we do need to keep per retention schedule and email. So if it formally documents a decision that was made, or if it's the end product of a documented process or evidence of work that you've done, you should keep those in accordance with retention schedules based on the content or the subject matter. If you have the only copy of an email with value, so for example, if you received the email from an outside source, then you should keep it. If you're the author of the email, it's your responsibility to manage it and its responses. When it comes to identifying the official copy, the custodian is generally going to be the sender. And it's strange to say because it's not our sent box that we're looking at every day. We're looking at our inbox. But really, the sent messages are where you are the author. So if you created a Word document, you'd be responsible for filing that Word document appropriately. Think of an email in the same way. If you've created it as the author, you're the responsible party. And so managing your sent messages is really important. It's not to say delete your inbox. Don't do that. I didn't say that. The recipient or your inbox can have the official copy if it's received from an external source, or if you need to take action, or if it's required to document an action. But each time you send an email or read an email, make an immediate decision, because the content is never going to be fresher for you to organize that email than when you've just read it or you've just sent it. Make that decision. Delete it because it's transient or non-record. File it because it is a record. It needs to be retained according to retention schedule. Unfortunately, this is what we usually do, and I'm guilty of this too. I flag it for follow-up. But eventually we do follow up, and then we need to either file it or delete it as transient. There are a ton of risks and liabilities that go along with electronic messaging, not just email, but I am talking about text messaging, instant messaging, because we all have instant messaging on our systems now as well. Illegal destruction of records, $1,000 per message. And I used to say, you know, we haven't tested text messages in case law yet. Well, if you Google Cincinnati Gang of Five, it's the Cincinnati Council people, they held a meeting basically via text message. They did get fined $1,000 per text message up to the maximum limit. Other risks and liabilities, unable to provide prompt responses to records requests. possible violation of public records laws and court costs, because we can't necessarily get a hold of those records as easily. It takes longer to search. It could be that we have to ask for somebody's phone in order to get copies of those records. That presents issues in discovery and litigation as well. Additionally, we don't have the basic capture technology, and a lot of the capture technology that exists doesn't preserve the metadata that we need to prove the authenticity of the records. It could mean reputational exposure. Again, for all of these, Google Cincinnati Gang of Five, they just settled, and reputational exposure was a big issue. Making copies of everything on a phone increases the time and resources needed to locate and preserve pertinent messages. And yet, even if we do that, we can only get those messages that still exist. We can't get those deleted messages. And that goes back to that illegal destruction of records. Retaining messages beyond the stated retention requires more time and resources to locate and compile for public records and discovery. We run the risk of inadvertent information exposure. If you're using your cell phone and doing text messaging and it's business stuff, there is the potential that somebody could get your phone and get that information. And so that is a security risk. And then we do have the potential violation of open meeting laws with email, with text messaging, instant messaging, all those things. So if you are a person who has a public body that needs to meet for open meetings, you actually have to be careful of how many of those people are included on email and cell phone chains. So when's it okay to text, and when should we put something in email? It's okay to text if it's a transient quick message, like telling your boss you're stuck in traffic, or that you have a sick child and you won't be in, or to ask if you're ready for lunch or what time the meeting is. So something that's very, very transient, then it's okay to text. But use email if it is more business related, because email we're still capturing on our servers, and we're able to file it and search for it and get to it if we need to. So if it documents a business transaction or activity or decision, use email. If there could be legal and compliance implications to whatever message you're sending, use email. If we need to have it as proof or evidence, use email. And then 2 basic questions. Would somebody expect me to have it? Or if it were in paper, would we retain it as a record? And if the answer is yes to either of those, then I highly recommend using email instead of text messaging to send that communication. So that was very, very short on email. Before we go into the last bit, which is organizing email and electronic records, are there any questions about email? All right, if those come up at the end, we can discuss those, but we will keep moving forward. We have a lot of unmanaged places that we store records. Could be shared drive, could be Buckeye Box, could be other places as well. Some of the problems with these places, if they contain important documents and records, those important things are intermingled with information that is duplicative, or things that are non-records, or records that are past their retention. So as you're going to see, there are some ways to store things where we can easily get stuff out per retention, and other ways where it's very, very time consuming and hard to tell. And so therefore, these types of things sit in intermingled, and that makes it very, very difficult and time consuming to clean out these spaces. Generally, things in these shared drives and unmanaged spaces lack standard naming conventions. We each name things whatever we feel like naming them so that we personally can search for them and find them. But will somebody else be able to figure out what we named a file or what folder we put it in? And a lot of times in these spaces, ownership is also unclear. It could be that it was a terminated or transferred employee, or a student employee that kept a file. Nobody wants to take responsibilities for these remaining records because they don't know. They don't know if it was a copy or a duplicate or a non-record. they don't know exactly what the record series is for it. So it's very hard for somebody who didn't create the record to then attempt to match it up to a retention schedule. And this is why these things go and just continue to grow without any kind of deletion or management. So let's look at a situation that's not ideal. We'll take a very small finance department, 4 people, and let's look at how they file. So Jane has 4 folders. She has purchase orders, purchase requests, vouchers, and warrants. Well, that's pretty good. She's named everything according to record series. And now we have Joe. Oh, look, hey, Joe has the exact same files. But there's still a problem with this. Because even though Joe and Jane have a standard naming convention, the problem is if I want a purchase order from fiscal year 2018, I still need to go to Jane's file and Joe's file, because these are filed by person's name first, by employee name, the employee who is working with the records. So I still have to go at least 2 places to find all of the purchase orders from FY18. And then if we look at John's, he names things a little bit differently. Checks, finance stuff, John stuff, miscellaneous finance stuff. It's going to be really hard for Jane to figure out where things might be in John's files if John's on vacation or if he retires and she needs to access that information. And then Sue has current vouchers, old vouchers, POs, things people want us to buy, and warrants. So she has some naming things that overlap, but you'll notice that while she does have purchase orders, instead of writing it out as purchase orders, she has labeled it as POs. So again, no standard naming convention for the same things. And then she has current vouchers and old vouchers. So now, in order to find a purchase order from FY18, I'm going to 4 places, and in each of those places, some is more obvious than the others where it's going to be. I'm actually not sure where I'm going to find POs in John's folders. We can do something a little more functional with filing, though. If we create standard naming or standard file structures in a common place, everybody who works with those records and has a responsibility for those records can file in the same area. And we take the name out of it and we make the record series the high level. So in this one, we made vouchers, the high level record series, and then we made a folder for each fiscal year. So when retention has run, all we have to do is delete 1 folder. Or if we're looking for vouchers for FY16, we only have to go to 1 place, because John and Jane and Sue, they're all filing in these folders right here. When we look at request to purchase, this is a little bit different. There's a couple subfolders, one for fulfilled and one for open. So when they get that request, they file it in the open. And then when the request is fulfilled, they move those things from open up to the fulfilled folder. And then we really only worry about applying retention to the fulfilled folder, because that's that active period. It's active while it's open. The active period ends when it's fulfilled, and then the rest of the retention period starts counting from there. If we look at it this way, structuring your shared drive, if we take leaves of absence have a 5-year retention. So what we want to do is we want to have 5 folders. 1 for each year of retention that we have to have. We have to have 5 full years. So you'll see there's 6 folders here. And that's because if we only do destruction once a year, in order to have 5 full years, we would have the 5 years that we have to have, and we would have the current partial year. As soon as the current year is done, so in this case, leaves of absence go by the calendar year, so as soon as we hit December 31st, that folder is closed off, and on January 1st of the next year, we can get rid of the oldest folder in this category. So we're maintaining 1 folder for every year of retention, and then an additional folder for the current year. If it's been a long time since you've cleaned out, you could even add another folder that's just called past retention. And every say leaves of absence that's already past retention, file it into that one. And then when the cleanup is done, send in the CRD and get rid of the past retention folder. But that way you're not sending a CRD every time you find a leave of absence that's past retention. Some additional folder structures, just so that you can visualize advising files. You might have active advisees, and then you have inactive, and then it's underneath the inactive. That's when you have per year that they went inactive. In the public records requests, we have a folder for every year of public records requests, and then even within those, we have a further breakdown of open requests versus closed requests, and then a folder for each request, because every single public records request is going to have multiple documents that are going into it. So how does this look when we structure Outlook? You can structure Outlook basically the same way. There are those same record series again. They're just listed in Outlook. But they mirror the structure in a shared drive or in Buckeye Box. And so while we'd still have to go person by person, unfortunately, in Outlook, at least we know that they're categorizing the same way. And so we can go to the mirrored category in Outlook for each person that we need to get this information from. Your shared drive structure may be bigger because you've got a lot of people, but not every person works on absolutely every function. Some people may only work on 1 or 2 functions of the office. It's those functions that need to be mirrored in Outlook. So everybody doesn't need the full file structure for the unit. They just need the structure for those records that they are actively working with. So it really is okay to delete email, and it's okay to delete electronic records as long as they've met their retention schedule, and that we do it consistently, and that we have an approved CRD. And if you file functionally, like I talked about, it's very easy to do that CRD. I think people get nervous because they don't want to fill out a form every time they delete an email. But if all you have to do is go and delete a folder for a particular record series for a particular year, filling out that CRD is the same thing as pulling that folder out of a filing cabinet and completing the CRD for it. You can immediately delete transient and non-records like we talked about. And there's some animation that I forgot about. Sorry about that. We can't keep all email and electronic records because it increases storage space and maintenance costs and retrieval time. It increases the number of things that we need to provide for public records. And it increases the cost of discovery, whether it's production, preservation, legal review. The more we have, the more money we spend on attorneys to do that legal review. And it increases our liability when we keep things too long. What it does decrease, though, if we keep things forever, is our ability to quickly locate things, our defensibility, and our compliance with all kinds of standards, including security standards and privacy standards at this point. There's a fine line between business value and over-preservation. That's the line we're looking for when we develop retention schedules. We're looking for how long do we need to keep this record? What's the administrative, fiscal, legal, and historical value? And we're going to set the retention at the highest and feel comfortable knowing that once that time period has met, we can delete those records, and we should delete those records. One final note, when an employee leaves, their records continue to be records. Just because that employee's gone does not mean that the records they created and the emails that they sent while they were here lose their record status. They don't. They're still records. If they're organized functionally, instead of by name, they're going to be searchable, retrievable. They're going to be easier for those people who have taken over those functions to find it, and easier to implement retention and disposition without having to guess as to what something is. As far as emails go, if you're a supervisor, you can request access through the IT service desk to a former employee's mailbox for a certain amount of time. You just need to email them and request that access. So with that, we have a couple minutes. Are there any questions? Like I said, this was kind of a high-level overview. There are other Paper and Bytes courses that we go through this in more detail. And I'm always willing to talk you through anything, come over, take a look at what you have, and work through this process. Are there any questions? All right. Well, I appreciate everyone's time. And I know a lot of this stuff it will become more clear when you kind of sit down and start to go through this process. So, please do feel free to contact me if you have any questions.
Thanks very much for doing this for us today. We really appreciate it.
Oh, you're quite welcome. Happy to do it. All
Thanks,
right.
everyone.
Everybody's time, and happy Friday, everyone.
See ya. Thanks a bunch.